3 weeks gone and the combatants gone, returning over the nightmare ground, we found the place again and found the soldier sprawling in the sun, the frowning barrel of his gun overshadowing. As we came on that day, he hit my tank with one like the entry of a demon. Look, here in the gun pit spoil the dishonoured picture of his girl, who has put Steffi, vergiss my nicht, a copybook Gothic script. We see him almost with content, based, and seeming to have paid and mocked at by his own equipment that's hard and good when he's decayed. But she would weep to see today how on his skin the swart flies move, the dust upon the paper eye, and the burst stomach like a cave. For here the lover and killer are mingled, who had one body and one heart, and death, who had the soldier singled, has done the lover mortal hurt. Wow. Every time I read that book, that poem, Vergiss my nicht by Keith Douglas, it always kind of, hits you a little bit in the stomach, a bit like the burst open stomach. But anyway, welcome everybody to We Have Ways of Making You Talk.
About the Battle of Alamein. Yeah.
Alamein week. And we're here, of course, with me, James Holland, with Al Murray, of course, and John McManus, our pal in the United States of America. And actually, a lot of people don't realize it, but the US played a much bigger role in that summer in the Western Desert than many people appreciate.
No, please, Jim, don't shatter my Anglo-centric.
It's an entirely British victory. What are you talking about?
Yeah, thank you, John. You can go
Blasphemy.
now. You can go now, John. That'll do.
Okay, I'll see you guys. Have a good
one. Welcome, John. And of course, one of the things we've been talking about already is that the Eighth Army anyway is a British Empire army, Dominion's army.
It's a Duke force.
A Duke force, as we like to call it. So, I mean, it may come as a surprise, though, to some that there is considerable American involvement in this story, and not just in the Sherman tanks that arrived to be the backbone of a more advanced armoured capability for Eighth Army, but the strategic big picture, the intelligence picture, the Air Force picture, and in fact, running through the whole thing, there's American involvement. Where do you want to start, John? What for you is the first sort of standout American contribution to the Alamein picture?
Well, when I think of that, I mean, I think of it almost as the Lend-lease picture, as the foundation. This is what sort of got the U.S. into the war in the first place, is deciding, you know what, we're going to supply the Allies with everything they possibly need, and then we're going to pretend to be neutral. So that's how we're led into the war. And of course, you got all the pressures of the Pacific that's going on, but there's still the priority for Europe. And FDR feels that very strongly. And he's really concerned about what's going to happen in the fall elections in 1942, the congressional elections, that possibly you'd have quite a few Asia firsters who tended to find a home in the Republican Party more than the Democratic Party. He's a little concerned about that. So he really wants to buttress the Europe first policy any way he can. And I think one way to do that is, to step up the pace of providing needed weaponry to the British, in addition to protecting the Suez Canal and avoiding this nightmare scenario, the Axis controlling Middle Eastern oil.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because there's no question that the Middle Eastern oil is of far more greater benefit to Germany than it is to the British. But I think it's worth just pointing out that on the 21st of June, when Tobruk falls, Winston Churchill is with FDR, and FDR immediately says, okay, what can we do to help? And literally, as if he'd already prepared the line, Churchill says, give us as many Shermans as you can spare. And he goes, all right, I'm going to give you 300. I'll see what I can do. Talks to Marshall, and Marshall is kind of splutters and goes, okay, Chief, well, if that's what you want, that's what we'll do. And sends them over. And I think they sail on the 12th of July, don't they?
Yeah. And I mean, the other thing about that, if the Shermans are going to the Middle East, then they're not going to the buildup of U.S. forces in the United Kingdom, which means you're not going to have your so-called Second Front in France in 1942, which, I mean, this may...
Sledgehammer.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm an outlier among U.S. historians, but to me, that was always just a complete pack of
No
nonsense that you could begin to pull this off. The British, in my view, were so far ahead of the Americans in terms of their understanding of the current state of the war and the importance of air power and sea power and launching invasion. The Americans were always so over optimistic that I really don't. And these were smart strategists: Eisenhower, Marshall, many others who are quite influenced by them. These are people who are going to end up in key roles in the war, and for good reason. Yet they somehow think that Sledgehammer and then later Roundup, can be pulled off and would be productive.
This is something I've always wondered about. Do they really think they're going to be able to do that?
I mean, I'm amazed too, but there are some pretty high class strategists who seem to really believe in this. And, George Marshall, Eisenhower, when he finds out that Sledgehammer is a no-go, he writes, "This is the blackest day in history." He is.
Yeah.
He absolutely. So in a way, there's a kind of, it's a bit of a Soviet-centric view of the war at this point that the Americans have, because they're really concerned about a Soviet collapse. And, they see Roundup as a way to kind of fall on their swords for the Soviets. It also, and I'm not saying that the military strategists are affected by this, but certainly the White House is. The left is just in a froth over a second front because, that's what Stalin wants. So much of the left, the labor unions and whatnot in the United States, are taking their cue from that. So there's a lot of political pressure to have this. And of course, there's cynicism with the idea of getting involved in the Mediterranean and the Middle East as sort of just helping the British Empire. And so FDR is running against those tides in a way.
What happens is the Molotov comes over, and he comes over to Britain in May and says, we really need help. We need the second front. We need to do all this stuff. And the British sort of pay him lip service. Say, yeah, quite. So absolutely, we're fighting in, Africa and drawing troops away, and we're going to continue our bombing, blah blah blah. Look at us, we're just about to do the 1,000-bomber raid. And then he flies over to Washington and says, we really need to start you a second front immediately. And Marshall sort of goes, yeah, bring it on. We're absolutely pumped. We're good to go. We're building up in England. That's exactly our plan. So they've kind of promised Molotov, and they've got themselves into a bit of a pickle where it becomes, even though Eisenhower has absolute guts and says it's the blackest day ever, there are some other heads who are realizing that this just isn't going to happen. And at this point, Churchill says, well, look, I've got this brilliant idea, which could kill two birds with one stone.
Well, because he knows that's what's realistic.
And it's realistic. And frankly, it is a really good plan. And whichever way you look at it, it's the best plan for the circumstances.
The other thing is that, you have an entire generation of U.S. officers who have been trained that strategy in winning wars means going straight to the core, straight to the source of your enemy and collapsing them that way. And obviously that's France and straight into Germany. Yeah. So to them, the Mediterranean is tangential.
Yeah.
So the British and American approaches to strategy are completely different, because the British is opportunistic and kind of probe around until you go in the weak spot and then exploit it. Whereas, as you say, John, the American is draw a straight line to Berlin.
And the British way of doing it is you've got a global empire, so get them to come and fight you somewhere at your convenience rather than at theirs. And wear them out doubly, because inevitably your opponent won't have a navy that could compete with the Royal Navy. Blah blah blah. And I mean, it is. It's always one of those things. After Overlord, and actually how difficult all this stuff turns out to be, there's sheepish people later on who go, well, thank God we didn't try that in 1942. Or is it just quite one of those things that's quietly forgotten?
I think it's quietly forgotten. It's like, hey, that wasn't us. Don't look this way. Don't look at our diaries from 1942 and our policy papers and all that. I mean, but the other thing too, this is just emotionally and culturally, the Americans hadn't had the same experiences the British had, at least in relation to Europe. The British had terrible traumatic experiences of being kicked off the continent, basically twice. And I don't know that they're eager to go in there and tangle again anytime soon. The Americans have that experience in the Philippines, of course, but that has no impact on how they're viewing Europe. And the idea is, well, if it's to be Europe first, Germany first, well, then let's get after it. That makes sense, except you don't have the ships and the planes and the troops. So
right. But in the case of Eisenhower, I mean, Eisenhower comes over in, when is it, March, I think, and doesn't he comes over first, doesn't he? And reports on what he sees. There's some colonel, isn't there, or brigadier general, he's in charge, and he's making a bit of a hash of it, and it's all a bit slack, and no one's really got their kind of best foot forward. And he goes back and says to Marshall, look, I'm not really that impressed with how it's all going. I really think you need a change of personnel at the top. You need someone who's going to kind of be able to report back well, and going to kind of, do what you and government wants, and really kind of go for it. And Marshall turns around and goes, well, I think that person is you. And he goes, what, me? And he goes, yes, absolutely you. And off Ike goes. And his number two is, of course, is Mark Clark, who has already made a name for himself as someone who's won a Distinguished Service Cross, I believe, in France. He's been wounded in 1917, first sort of scraps over in the First World War. So he's got combat experience, but he's also got very, very good administrative experience. He's done very well in the kind of Louisiana maneuvers and all this kind of stuff. So he goes over as Ike's number two. And when they get over there, that's what they're focused on, is this cross-channel invasion. So psychologically, you've prepared yourself for this momentous thing. And that's where all your energy, all the focus of your intellectual power, everything is going towards that. And then suddenly you're told that it's all off and actually you're going to go to Africa. Psychologically, that sea change is just a bit of a jolt. And that famous kind of diary entry from Eisenhower where he says, this is the blackest day and all this kind of stuff. To be fair, he and Clark both get over it pretty quickly. And once they start realizing that actually they've got their hands full just sorting out Torch, as it's going to become called, the invasion of Northwest Africa, which is being planned, they come round to it very, very quickly, I think. And I think you can see that in the literature when you read the kind of, the Harry Butcher diaries, and he's this naval aide that Ike knows, who goes with him and basically kind of records what he's up to and all the rest of it. But it's this very entertaining diary. But both him and Clark, who are kind of in charge of it, you can see that they are not long in coming round to the good sense of this operation. And once they've converted, they're 100%, 120% behind it, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And Clark, of course, famously even goes into, into French Northwest Africa ahead of a time to get a sense of trying to cut a deal with the Vichy French and to try and make sure you're not going to have resistance and all that. And that, that takes some courage, obviously, to do it, and some belief, I think, in the concept, I suppose. Clark and Eisenhower were pretty good partners, too. They'd known each other a long time, since West Point. Eisenhower was 2 years ahead of Clark. Their wives knew each other well. Clark had helped really redesign and modernize the American ground forces, basically the triangular division. Eisenhower had a great deal of confidence.
Just to explain what you mean by the triangular division for those who don't know.
So the triangular division meant basically that you're going to have 3 regiments that comprise a division rather than 4, like you had in World War One. In World War One, you had these big, ungainly divisions with 4 regiments that were divided into 2 brigades, like 26,000 guys. World War II, they're much more nimble in that they have 3 regiments, and they have to be, in part because of shipping. And
a regiment, I should just say, is like in an infantry regiment is like an infantry brigade in the British system. So that would have 3 battalions. So you might have the 133rd Regiment, which would have the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd battalions, and the 134th and the 138th or something. That would make up your division.
Exactly. Yeah,
and they have those battalions, and then all the companies are labeled A, B, C, D, and then the next 3, and then next 4.
It was such a great system, in my opinion, as a student of the U.S. Army and one who has followed it from World War II through now. From the 1950s on, like post Korea, it almost seems to me like it's designed to be as confusing and jumbled and chaotic as possible. In World War II, they preserved the old regimental lineage for all these great units, like the 16th Infantry, the 7th Infantry, the 18th, it goes on. And yet they had this sort of modular system that was the same in every unit, most 1st, 2nd, 3rd Battalion, always known as red, white, and blue. Yeah. And then the companies, A through D, E through G, all that kind of stuff. So you knew exactly. And it's kind of fun for my students, by the way, when I teach this, because they learn very quickly. I'm like, okay, so if I'm a member of A Company, 7th Infantry, which battalion am I in? Yeah. And they're like, 1st, it's got to be 1st. And they feel like military experts then. Nowadays, it's like, okay, you're in B Company of the 4th Battalion and this 1st Maneuver Brigade of this, that, and the other, and you're just like, wait a minute, where are we? It's absurd.
Well, yes, and you can be the 2nd Rifle Brigade, but actually, which is just a battalion and part of which is part of the 7th Motor Brigade, which is then part of 7th Armored Division. It's all very confusing. You can be kind of next to the 6th Durham Light Infantry.
But this is a function of bureaucracies, aren't they? As they've got to give themselves things to do, haven't they? It sort of feels like sort of peacetime secretion rather than a
It is.
Like a wartime essence of how you would do a thing. I mean, the other thing, of course, that's obviously going to put you off doing Roundup and Sledgehammer or whatever, is that the British are performing very badly in this spring, the spring summer of 1942. So you might be looking at the war and thinking, well, what actually can be done, which leads directly to Churchill's appeal to FDR after Tobruk, is that actually, rather than a cross-channel invasion, got to be a bit more realistic here. I mean, because things are going very, very badly for the British at this stage. They can't tie their bootlaces, and the British Army has kind of got a sort of complex about the Germans that they can't beat them. I think.
Yeah, but don't forget up until the end of May when Rommel launches his attack and it all goes pear-shaped very quickly. There is no expectation that they're going to lose. Not from London.
Well,
London's
not watching things closely enough in North Africa.
No, but maybe not. But it's 4 weeks between Rommel's attack and the fall of Tobruk on the 21st of June.
Yes,
and the expectation is that the more troops are coming in, more troops are going out to North Africa. That American Lend-lease is coming in. That American troops are arriving in Britain, which means you can release divisions from Britain who are on home defence. They can now go over. So there is a growing confidence that actually this can be done. Yeah. Then there is this massive setback which no one's been planning on, which they then have to kind of take into account. But as we know, by the 3rd of July, Rommel's attempt to kind of hustle his way through is over because his attacking the Alamein line in the beginning of July doesn't work. So by the middle of July, which is the time, incidentally, what we're talking about when these decisions about, Sledgehammer and moving it to Torch and all the rest of it are taking place, that's kind of that one's sorted. And once you know that that's sorted, then it's sort of okay again. I think.
You still got to have within the American military establishment, there must be this tension between how the British have actually performed to a great degree. You're talking about one period where things have settled down, where if you look, as John points out, the British have been kicked out of the continent twice. There's been a sort of jumble of things happening, and what's happening in the Far East isn't good either. And yet, at the same time, the British, when they come to confer with the Americans, are super organised, super pessimistic. Say, I can't do that, can't do this, old boy. There must be. You're absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a terrible idea, sir.
Right. It clashes with this sort of innate American optimism.
Precisely.
Well, we're in the war now, so don't worry.
We're going to win.
Everything under control. Yeah. We're going to win, and we can do this, and we can do this, and this, and it's great to have a can-do attitude. But when it's at variance with reality, then there's a problem. I mean, the Royal Navy is in crisis in mid-1942, and the United States Navy is too. Yeah. So that's what's going to have to buttress these grand plans. If you can't control the U-boats, you're not going to be able to do anything. So you're lucky to do any operations in North Africa, much less what's happening in Malta. So the Americans come into this with this expectation, don't worry. Things are under control now. We're here to help. And then I think they just have to kind of come up against reality and take a reality pill. And it's the British.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the delegation comes over on the in the 3rd week of July to London to discuss Sledgehammer, and almost immediately the British say, look, chaps, we've been thinking, I know we said we were up for it, but that was just basically to get you in the war. And basically, at Arcadia, we were happy to say anything you wanted to make sure that this was Germany first policy. Truth of the matter is, our heart was never in it. We all knew that this was absolutely never going to happen. We're out. And everyone goes, and all the Americans are going, what? What can you mean? They go, well, we have this other idea. And within 4 days, they arrive on the talks over on the 20th, it's by the 24th of July, it's a done deal. Gymnast is on, or Torch as it becomes. Mm-hmm. It's suddenly the new strategy. And I do think even Torch is quite punchy when you're as you point out, the war in the Atlantic is by no means over at this point. Even though summer, it's kind of easier to maneuver stuff around than it is in winter.
Yeah,
when the days are longer.
In the really big picture, it's a really brilliant concept. The whole anvil concept, hammer and anvil. I mean, El Alamein on one side and the Torch on the other. You really capture the Axis in a vice. Now, how you're going to pull this off is another matter altogether.
Yeah,
Eighth Army
absolutely.
has the luxury of being able to build up, reinforce, resupply, get its leadership on track. They have that luxury in part because of the war in Russia. And then, yes, the U.S. is able to muster enough to put some forces ashore in Northwest Africa. Of course, what happens after that is another hash up too. So it's the concept is great. The implementation is really difficult.
The implementation, this idea that you have 3 invasion forces, one coming 3,000 miles, the other 2 coming 1,000 miles each, all landing, you're due to land in the Mediterranean, which at that time is hostile, at the same time and at the right place. And they do. I mean, the enormity of this project is just off the radar. And this is one of the reasons why I when I look at Clark's performance in Italy, I always cut him quite a lot of slack just from the start off with, because basically, from the point of view of the ground operations, is his plan. And he's you can't argue that Clark doesn't do a superb job in organizing the invasion force of Torch. I mean, obviously, it's the Navy that's the navies that are delivering them, but it's his concept and his preparation that's got the troops ready for it, and that's no small achievement when neither side has done anything of this scale ever.
And when there wasn't an American army really 2 years previously. I mean,
right. I mean, when you consider
in a meaningful sense,
you've been in the war for less than a year, and you can already do this. And in addition, by the way, to the what's going on at Guadalcanal, and what's going on in New Guinea, which are absorbing significant U.S. resources there. No, I think it's absolutely remarkable, the resilience. But you're seeing something, the kind of operational brilliance you're going to have later on when you have these massive amphibious invasions and all the coordination. By Normandy, they've reached the sort of expert stage on some levels. Torch is the sort of beginning of this, but they're hardly novices.
Okay, so that's the strategic picture. The intelligence side of stuff, which sort of keys into this, the most famous sort of part of this picture is the unfortunate business of Bonifellas. Although in the end he sort of comes good, because his pessimistic reports about Eighth Army prompt FDR to act. So you it cuts both ways, the Bonifellas thing. But I mean, for those who don't know the story, John, do you want to just live it out for us, flesh it out for us?
Yeah, so Bonifellas was the U.S. military attaché in Egypt. And he was, of course, sending all these very detailed reports back to Washington about the state of Eighth Army, the war in North Africa, the geopolitical situation in Egypt, and so on and so forth. His communications are being read by both the Italians and the Germans, who had broken into the U.S. embassy in Rome, and appropriated the codes and all this. And Fellers really had no idea of this, and so Fellers was a great source of intel for Rommel. Ironically, Fellers is an interesting cat. I mean, he was a West Pointer. He had graduated that accelerated class in 1918, to try and get them into the war as quickly as possible. He'd been around the block quite a bit in his career. And he was sort of a psyops guy too. He had, was going to flirt with the OSS. He's eventually going to end up with MacArthur as his military secretary and psyops guy. He has a lot of different layers to his military career. In this one, the irony of ironies is that he's kind of anti-British, yet he's right there reporting in such a way that it really helps the British. Yeah. I mean, to be sure, he wants to help the British, but also there's this contempt there too.
Yes, he's very, very down on things, isn't he? And I mean, his information's coming from sort of talking to people rather than actually. He's not going through anyone's files, is he? It's the impression he's getting of what's going on. His friends he's talking to, his contacts, sort of because attaché stuff, rather than he's not reading Eighth Army's reports. He's not that well informed, is he?
So no, he's a networker.
Yeah,
he's a networker.
Guesstimates and
So he is just talking to various folks. I mean, he lives in the staff world in a way, but he also he's not averse to talking to soldiers too, and some lower level commanders and whatnot. So, but he is a networker who has built up all these sources, as any military attaché should. He's very much in tune with what's going on in Cairo, but also I think he has a good feel for Eighth Army and something of its capabilities. You don't often see that kind of combination. So he's really an asset, but it just so happens that obviously his communications are compromised. And we don't know this for the better part of 9 months or a year, whatever it is. It's, it's partially what leads to the Tobruk disaster. That the Axis know precisely what we're doing. So Bonner Fellers, eventually, he is not really going to pay the career price for this. It really wasn't quite his fault. So he is, eventually going to be sent back to work with the OSS and then on to MacArthur's command the rest of the war, where he plays a pretty key role on MacArthur's staff.
Because he'd spent the 30s in the Philippines before the war. So he's, I mean, and it's interesting because Seabohm shut down around about the same time, isn't he, Jim? So
he's captured in mid-July.
So Rommel loses these two info streams.
So the 621st radio,
that's right,
whatever it is.
But those are. But I mean, it also does show that the Americans are really keenly watching what's going on and really want to know exactly what's happening, rather than necessarily take the British's word for it as to how things are going. Because you're going to get a rosier picture in London, aren't you, than you will on the ground. And does that indicate that the Americans don't trust the British, or that they feel that they better not trust the British? Or I mean, what's that? What's it?
I just think a lot of the Americans are very leery of getting drawn into the British imperial designs in the Mediterranean. And so if we're going to be involved in this, there better be a damn good reason, is the thinking. And where this stems from, in a way, is the disillusionment with World War One. Because there's a sense, because of the Treaty of Versailles and all this, that, we had fought that war in order to advance British imperial designs. There was profound disillusionment with that. And so, remember, it's Japan that had brought the U.S. into this war, and then Europe just kind of follows along because Hitler's dumb enough to declare war on the U.S. and whatever. So there's still that element, whether in or out of the military, of opinion saying, hey, let's be careful. Let's not, start shedding our blood for the furtherance of the British Empire here. And and all you do is take one look at Eighth Army. It's a Commonwealth army. And so I think a lot of it, they're like, I'm a little leery about that. At the same time, though, too, I should say there's concern that the Germans are going to have this nightmare scenario where they'll come down from the Caucasus and then over from Egypt and, in a pincers, grab Middle Eastern oil. And that gets everyone's attention, too.
And there's no question also that the very new and young U.S. Army, it is an opportunity for them to kind of flood themselves, learn some of the lessons against, certainly initially at any rate, a comparatively straightforward opposition, and kind of test systems and, do tank destroyer regiments, for example, do they work? This great concept of,
right.
I mean, do you know what I mean? But I mean, that's one of those things which was unique to the U.S. Army, and what a better place to try it than in the kind of Southern Tunisia.
Well, and as it turned out, they needed it. They really needed that seasoning, big time. Most of the units did. Even the Big Red One, the 1st Infantry Division, doesn't acquit itself very well. Initially, at what we call the Kasserine Pass, the Battle of Kasserine. That's actually the better part of the battle, versus the first debacle. So I mean, that's just. I think the Americans have to face a little humility too, rather than this idea, well, we're here to save you guys. Actually, we got a long way to go and a lot to learn. And I think the North Africa campaign serves that well. I think it also made great sense to provide the British with all that equipment that is going to pay off at El Alamein. The Sherman tanks, famously, of course, but plenty of other stuff too.
Yeah. We need to take a quick break right now. We'll be back in a second. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk about the Battle of El Alamein. And we're joined by the peerless John McManus.
America comes in recognizing that air power is a key to this, that it's absolutely locked in with ground operations. They're hungry to kind of learn new techniques and new ways, and what's the difference between strategic air power and tactical air power and all this kind of stuff. And they do send over a not insignificant number of heavy bombers, but also fighters as well. I think it's 2 fighter groups and 1 heavy bomber group to start off with. There's the Halpro detachment, isn't there? Which is a kind of sort of half unit, which is supposed to go to China, but then they kind of think, okay, well, that's not going to work. Clamps in Burma, so we might as well send it to the Middle East. And there's this integration within the Desert Air Force and all sorts of stuff. I mean, there's a movement of General Russell, and then General Lewis Brereton gets sent over to set up a strategic air force. And, there's quite a lot going on, isn't there? There's quite a big commitment and a diversion away from Britain to the Middle East.
And from the Asia and Pacific theater to the Middle East, too.
Yes, of course.
So all this means tough choices, so it's going to have opposition. MacArthur is very much up in arms about this at a time when we need those B-24s to be hunting down Japanese shipping and also, dealing with the U-boats and everything else. So this is controversial, but obviously it's a choice that FDR feels has to be made, and I think probably events prove him right. It's also very interesting to me that Louis Brereton ends up in the mix here too. He's one of the ultimate survivors in this war,
isn't he?
From a brass point of view. I mean, he had been MacArthur's air commander during the debacle in 1941-42 in the Philippines. And though we can't pin the whole, Clark Field debacle on him, certainly he plays a role in the U.S. losing about half its planes, partially on the ground. But just the fact that he gets out of the Philippines and doesn't become a POW is, a bit eye-opening. And that then they put him in charge of what at that point is really the lead aerial show from a U.S. standpoint. And then, of course, later he's going to be in charge because he is, well, he's respected for his flying record, his World War I record, but he is, like Fellers, he's a networker. He is a guy who understands keenly, almost to the savant level, how the administrative side of the war effort works, the bureaucracy, who to stay on good terms with, how to cover your own tracks. And I mean, he's done this. If you take a look, for instance, at his report to the Philippines, he does this brilliantly. I mean, you don't have to respect it, but you do have to say, wow, this guy understood a lot about covering his own tracks without seeming to do that.
Yeah.
So I don't want to paint him as too big of a Byzantine figure, but also he was slippery. He understood a lot, and he had a genial manner about him that was
people like him, don't they?
People tended to like him. Yeah,
Mary Cunningham gets on with him.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of his strengths. Actually, is I think he gets on better with the British and other allies than he does sometimes with his U.S. colleagues. Ridgway, for instance, gets along pretty well with him, but it really doesn't have a high regard for him.
Well,
and it's constantly sort of.
I suppose they don't know his reputation. So,
the British,
the British are new people who you have yet to discover that he's going to write some ass covering report later. I mean,
there's an amazing interview, isn't there, with Mary Cunningham and Lewis Brereton, and I think it's for Time magazine. If I remember rightly. I can't remember who it is, but they get interviewed by one of the kind of high profile. And it's kind of Alamein time, and they're saying, so how do you get, you've got an American Air Force with a British RAF Air Force, how do you get on? And Mary Cunningham goes, well, I need something from the Americans. I ring up Lewis and I say, come on over for a sundown. And Lewis Brereton goes, yeah. And when Mary calls me, I come over to him, and I know how the Brits love their gin, so I come over a bottle of gin, and we chink glasses and we sort it out.
Yeah.
And it's all very harmonious, and it's just completely fantastic.
And that continues when he's at a 1st Allied Airborne Army. I mean, it's all the way through the end of the war. I mean, that's the strength of Brereton.
There must be a sense, though, the sort of strategic machinations aside, that this is where the action is, right? So if you are an airman who's keen to learn and wants to develop stuff that you're going to need to use later all over the world, this is where the action is. This is where you can actually put your ideas into practice, rather than carry on theorizing.
Yep.
They're those kind of people, aren't they? They want to get in, they want to find out if their ideas work, rather than remain in the abstract. And that's particularly within the air community. There's been there's all that debate boiling on, and it boils on particularly about strategic bombing. But that's driving people to, put aside their qualms about the fact it's not an invasion of France or they're not in the Far East. And, this is where you can learn your trade, right?
Yeah, I think that's especially true of the combat flyers.
Yeah.
That this is the place to be in action. This is the
Yeah.
place where this is why you're a pilot. This is why you're a bombardier or whatever, that, you want to be where the action is.
Yeah.
If they couldn't send you to fight in the war against Japan, which might have been your first choice, if you're like the typical U.S. aviator at that point, this was the place to be. And of course, every fighter pilot dreamed of being an ace, shooting down Italian and German aircraft and all that. They found that the war was a lot less glamorous than that, of course. But yeah, I think that's a good point.
But it is interesting also that the 98th Bomb Group, which is the first bomb group that comes over, you have the Halpro detachment of B-24s, and then I think they get absorbed back into the 98th Bomb Group, if I remember rightly. But the 98th BG, I mean, they are the only heavy bombers in the Middle East. I mean, the British, the RAF never provides any four-engine bombers ever outside British shores, I think. Well, I mean, obviously they go to... No, I don't think they ever do. I don't think they ever do. There's no heavy bombers in Italy, for example. I know at the end of the war they're going to be sent to Japan or whatever, but they never actually get there. So this is the only long-range heavy bombing group that is in operation in North Africa. Lancasters sometimes are flying to Italy and then stage in Tunisia or something, but later on in the war. But that's not an insignificant contribution. And then you've got these two fighter groups. And what's quite interesting about them is that Brereton splits them up and adds them into the Desert Air Force, so that the squadrons get attached to a British fighter wing, or a Desert Air Force fighter wing, where they can kind of pick, so they're all in the same landing ground together with maybe a South African fighter squadron and a British fighter squadron, and they can all kind of pal around and kind of learn tactics and kind of sharpen their teeth and stuff. And again, that seems to me an incredibly sensible way of doing things.
Absolutely. Well, and it also shows you how you're going to operate together as allies.
Yeah.
I mean, you're so culturally similar. You have the linguistic similarities, shall we say. I mean, all of that is doable. The Italians and the Germans aren't doing that with each other.
Not at all. There is no
all.
crossover at all. I mean, they don't even share intelligence.
Right, exactly. And even the Feller stuff, they're both reading the Feller stuff, and sometimes they don't even know it. The other has it. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that was already a good you're seeing exactly how these allies are going to work together. I think as a U.S. flyer, you would learn a lot from these guys who have flown in the desert and have managed to survive against a pure operator, because you don't control the air. And you can imagine what a lab that is to learn in. The B-24s, I mean, what makes them popular is that, like you said, Jim, they're the only heavy bombers, in play in theater. And I think it's very interesting where they send them to Ploesti, because they understand exactly how vital those Ploesti oil fields are to the German war effort. So even though the big fighting is happening actually in North Africa, these guys are going on to Ploesti too, and that was a harbinger for what was going to happen later on too.
I mean, although that also shows, I mean, it's interesting that the British don't deploy heavies to this theatre. It shows that the British are content with area bombing, whereas the American strategic bombing thrust is for specific targets, is for industrial, infrastructure, resource targets, rather than contenting yourself with dehousing civilians. And also, I mean, it also speaks to the optimism of the American strategic bombing campaign at this point, doesn't it? That it thinks, well, we'll bomb the oil fields. That will have enough leverage in itself to damage the German war effort properly. Which, of course, further down the line is a sort of not how they're thinking anymore. But it's interesting that it shows that character of the American approach to strategic bombing, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. That's a kind of silver bullet approach.
Yeah.
Saying, okay, eliminate their oil, you eliminate their war industry. Later on, you'll see this at Schweinfurt and Regensburg. Eliminate their ball bearings, and you basically are going to collapse their war effort. If we project even farther on into the Vietnam War, Operation Rolling Thunder, during one of its phases, targets petroleum, oil, and lubricants in North Vietnam. It says, okay, if we can destroy that, then we'll bring North Vietnam to its knees. Always problematic, these ideas. But, obviously it does give you insight into the thinking. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And John, what about Americans actually fighting on the ground? Because there are some, aren't there?
Yeah, there's a few. This is the interesting thing, is that, you'd had some very idealistic people who had, even before the U.S. entered the war, decided, I need to be fighting against Nazism, against fascism somewhere. So they had joined the British forces. These were Ivy Leaguers, sort of elite
Yes.
people. And it's what's really kind of interesting to me is, you see this element of sort of idealistic U.S. opinion kind of on the elitist side of people volunteering pre-Pearl Harbor to go fight against the Axis, either like in the Eagle Squadron or for these. There's several guys who end up in the British forces fighting at El Alamein. I think there's 5 of them.
That's right.
What you don't have is idealistic people going to fight against Japan. Because where were you going to do that? You'd have to go to China, and that means just the Flying Tigers. And if we're being honest, most of them are mercenaries. They're being hired by Chiang Kai-shek to go and fight, and of course they're pilots. They want to fly and fight. But if you wanted to fight against the Nazis, you at least had that alternative of joining the British forces or the Canadian forces and going and doing your thing. And that's what these guys do, and they fight. They're involved in the whole demining thing.
Sure.
I mean, they're involved in infantry units, tanks. And a lot of them several of them are wounded very badly. I mean, it's just the name of one of them, a guy named Rob Cox, who is long lineage and tradition in sort of the upper crust in the U.S. And here he is fighting with the British forces at El Alamein. It's really interesting to see this. I think there were 18 overall who fought
That's
at El
right.
Alamein.
I think there were. I toured the Alamein battlefield with Rachel Cox, who was there doing research for her book that she subsequently wrote about those five that she picked out and focused on actions at Alamein. She was lovely, very nice person, and just totally fascinated by the whole thing that this uncle of hers could fall at Alamein. I'm pretty sure it was her uncle.
A completely different time and place, and very much ahead of the rest of their countrymen.
Yeah. Fascinating.
And there was another guy who went over and drove an ambulance. Couldn't get in as he was an ambulance driver, and then managed to get out of that and ended up fighting for the Gurkhas, being an officer in the Gurkhas in Burma. He ended up at the admin box in February 1944. Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, they did go on their journeys. It has to be said.
And when the British victory at Alamein comes, are there conclusions that the American army draw from that? Are they watching the battle? Are there people on the ground observing with 8th Army going, right, okay, this is food for thought? Or are they looking at it and going, we're not going to do things like this. We've worked our own way of doing things out. Because after all, it becomes a characteristically British battle, or the British battles then take on many of the characteristics that Montgomery sort of displays at Alamein, like heavy preparatory bombardment, colossal cracks, all this sort of Monty fighting. Are the US Army looking at that and going, wow, we're going to do things differently, or maybe he's got things figured?
I think they're studying the armor side,
right,
especially because the armor side of the U.S. Army, these folks think they're almost comparable to the naval aviators, at this time, who think, well, we've just completely reshaped and transformed warfare. We're the future, as opposed to these stodgy old battleship types and whatever.
Yep.
The armor people are like, okay, well, this is brand new warfare. We're going to have tank and maneuver warfare versus the infantry that's still stuck in the trenches back in World War I and all this. And so El Alamein seems to, and the Desert War as a whole, not just El Alamein, it seems to offer this sort of new vision of the tank as the lead weapon of war.
Yeah.
And I think that the Americans are also going to sort of learn some of the wrong lessons from that, of believing that they can fight these sort of mass tank engagements and mass maneuver. The desert terrain allowed you to do that for a time, but if you're in built-up urban areas or amphibious invasions, that's a different animal. Yeah. And that's generally what you're going to be doing. So I think that in that respect, the U.S. Army takes some of the wrong lessons. From an engineer standpoint, I think there's great lessons learned about how you're going to deal with minefields. And a lot of controversy, obviously, as to the way the British did it and whatever else. But I think there's a sense that this isn't going to be a one-off, that you're going to have to deal with getting your engineers forward and operating in combined arms as much as you possibly can. I do think that that's going to be one of the strengths of the U.S. Army, is how they're going to use their engineers.
Yeah. Is there anything else we need to pick John's brains about, Jim?
Well, of course,
there is forever.
Everything, but
shall be.
it's good.
Yeah.
I mean, the reason we haven't sort of focused too much on what happens at Torch really is because obviously that happened after the Battle of Alamein. That's the kind of next thing. But I do think it's good to be talking about the American contribution in the summer of 1942 and the contribution to the Alamein battle as well, because it is absolutely very real. And I think particularly when you think about all the machinations that are going on back in London with Clark and Eisenhower and the preparations for Torch and the bigger strategic pictures that are going on at the same time. But also, I think really it's I know there's those handful of volunteers in the 8th Army, but it's right from the outset getting it that air power and land power and naval power are kind of, they're a three-way brotherhood. And you see the Americans getting that. The first available opportunity they can to kind of pitch in, get some experience and think about things in a different way, they do it. Because heavy bombing, which is absolutely the thing that they're allied to, and dominates the strategic, dominates the kind of air thinking in the 1930s. That's a strategic operation. Whereas what they're doing in the Middle East is tactical. And I think it's really, really interesting that they go in there with such an open mind. And although the kind of 9 bomber and fighter groups, which are earmarked for the 9th US Army Air Force, only 3 of them have got there by the beginning of October 1942. That's still quite a level of commitment at a time where they're also trying to set up 8th Air Force as well in the UK. And it is a tacit understanding, I think, acknowledgement, I think, that right from the word go, the moment that Torch becomes a thing, that is also going to include a lot of air power as well and air resources. And this concept of close air support, of tactical air force, they're so open-minded to it, and you see that with people. Brereton absolutely is, but people like Tui Spots who are sent over to kind of help sort out 8th Air Force, and then almost immediately gets transferred over to kind of the Mediterranean. He's totally up for it. He gets it. He's the big strategic bomber, but he understands the importance of tactical support as well. And I think what is so fascinating about this moment is that the Americans, right from the word go, they might not understand what they're letting themselves into with something like Sledgehammer and this kind of idea that you can get across the channel in 1942. But they are very open-minded to the potential of air power. And you see this develop, this idea that you've got this hard cadre of emerging air commanders, whether it be Teller, whether it be Cunningham, whether it be Brereton, whether it be Pete Quesada, Jimmy Doolittle, whether it be Tui Spots, all these guys who suddenly find themselves converging into the Mediterranean theatre and the Middle East theatre are completely up for it. And there is this tangible level of excitement about the potential of what air power can achieve. And they're open-minded to it. They're like sponges. They just kind of like, let's bring it on. Let's do it. Let's learn it. Let's work out how we can take this on. And I think that's very exciting, and you can see the seeds of success in Tunisia in May 1943, and subsequently, how air power is incorporated into land operations in the rest of 1943 and into 1944, right through the end of the war. You can see it in this moment in the summer of 1943.
Yeah, I mean they're basically they're innovators. They're writing the doctrine as they go.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
It's very exciting for them.
That's an excellent point to sort of round up. Really, that we start at the beginning of the year, the sort of naive state of, oh, we'll invade France at some point later this year. To by the end, no, the actual business of learning how to do this war is in front of us, and we should grab the opportunity to do that. And that American attitude is staggering, really. It's so hard, I think, sometimes for people to think of the US before the Second World War, when it's not the global military superpower with aircraft carriers absolutely everywhere it wants them, and and bombs that can go around bombers that can go around the world in a day, and all that sort of stuff. The huge infrastructure, the business of there being a Pentagon, that's a thing that people know about in their lives and that's talked about on the news. That this has all happened from a standing start. That not even 2 years is absolutely. It's staggering, isn't it, Jim?
Phenomenal.
It is staggering.
It's phenomenal.
And coming out of the Depression too.
Oh God.
It all.
Yeah. It's just incredible.
It really is.
Well, thank you, John. Thanks for joining us on our little series of El Alamein. Thanks, everybody, for listening. We will see you very soon. Thanks, John. Thanks, Jim.
Cheers.
Thanks.